You've heard that all press is good press, but how do you successfully handle the spotlight when your business is at the center of a crisis? This is Nina Barbero for Chamber Chat, and today we're speaking with Kathleen Hessert, a public relations expert of more than 30 years, with experience helping world-class athletes, celebrities, and executives build their brands and say the right things at the right time. You might not have heard of Kathleen, but you've definitely heard of her clients: Peyton and Eli Manning, Venus and Serena Williams, P. Diddy, Shaquille O'Neal, and even Pope Francis. Hello, Kathleen, and welcome to Chamber Chat.
Hi, Nina. Glad to be here.
You've worked with many high-profile clients. What is the one thing they are most looking for your help with?
When people at the top of any organization, whether it be a C-level executive or an owner or it's a celebrity personality, when they come to me, generally they know they're lacking in some way, shape, or form. It could be a looming crisis. It could be something wonderful. When P. Diddy came to me, he was launching his music network. Now, here was a man who had as much exposure all over the world as anybody could imagine, and I'm thinking, well, why does he want me to help him prepare him for the media, in particular for him, for the launch of this? And it's because, he was putting in a make or break situation. Here was a whole huge organization, not just a company, because he had been an entrepreneur, but something even bigger than that he was staking everything behind. And he didn't often talk to the business media. So I remember I was preparing him in particular for a Wall Street Journal interview. And I go into my dragon lady mode when I'm doing mock interviews and so on. And all his people were around him, and we were in LA, and we were going till like 1 a.m, and I'm barraging him with questions, and he stopped and he was all flustered, and he said, well, why didn't you people prepare me for this? I can't do this interview tomorrow. And I said, Sean, we can do this. You can be ready. I can get you there. You just need to take a deep breath and turn around, and we'll anticipate the questions. We'll come up with the answers for you that you're comfortable with and that are authentic, and you'll be ready for this interview. So that surprised me. But then there are others. I write a lot of speeches for top people, and so some come to me for speech writing. Some come to me because they have, they just want to be better. Peyton Manning, I've been working with him since he was a junior at Tennessee. And he had to make a decision if he was going to stay or go to the NFL and be the #1 draft pick, or stay in college one more year, which was a total anomaly at that time. Nobody would stay if they had the opportunity, especially be #1 in the draft. And his dad, Archie, called me and said, can you help us? Peyton's got a big decision to make, and we need to be prepared for the onslaught. And so it was a matter. This is a guy who was #1 in high school in football, was #1 in college, was #1 in the pros multiple times. And people said, why would someone like that need your help? After 23, 24 years of working with them, it's because the best always want to be better. And they know often that if there's one little thing that can differentiate them from the competition, whatever that may be, that's what they want to be able to identify and activate, etc. So it depends on what their needs are. Do they need to be more charismatic as a speaker? Do they need a more charismatic speech that's right on target? Do they need to build their personal or organizational brand? It could be social media. I've worked since 2006 in social media, so was an early adopter. So we create strategies and applications for social media, and it's mind-boggling to a lot of people because they think, oh, it's easy. So I can post a tweet or an Instagram picture, and so I'm fine with social media, without any strategy behind it, without any alignment to their business goals. And so it's like, well, what do you mean I'm not doing this right? So it depends on what their needs are. Years ago our tagline was, we build communication champions. And it still is, because it doesn't matter what field they're in. If I was working with the CEO of KPMG, at that time he would say, now who are you working with on the PGA Tour? I mean, that's what he wanted to know before we talked about anything. And so people would ask me, what's the difference between the sports personalities you work with, whether it be a coach or a player or athlete of some sort, and the executives? And I say the uniform. That's the bottom line. They all have the same fears, insecurities, egos that to work with. And so it's a matter of getting down to one-on-one, what's going to work with them, what their real needs are, really listening to them, and then giving them candid feedback. A lot of people at the top of whatever they're doing, whether it's in a small organization or it's in a larger one or a celebrity field, they're used to yes men and yes women, sucking up to them, wanting to tell them what they think they want to hear, often because that's their livelihood. And I think that I've survived for so long because I don't suck up. If you don't want candid, you don't work with me, because I see things. I make it a habit of looking for and seeing things that a lot of people don't see, and connecting the dots and being very forthright in what works, what doesn't work, and why.
Can you share a few examples of how you've helped those high-profile clients overcome some negative perceptions?
Yes, I would say that it could be as simple as their physical appearance. I was hired by a major college athletic program. In fact, when the Board of Trustees hired their new football coach, it was with the caveat that he would work with me. And the first thing that the athletic director asked me to do was tell him not to wear white socks and to come into work on time. I'm like, you're paying me to tell him what you should be telling him? That's ridiculous. But his appearance gave a negativity. For the CEO of a major global organization, he was in at the time one of the big six accounting firms. He was had to run for and do a whole grassroots campaign to be named chairman. And here was a really bright guy, and he wanted the job, and he was capable of it, and he was a real visionary, but also had the ability to be tactical as well as visionary, and you don't always get that. And when I went around with him on these grassroots, listening meetings with his partners, he was standing in a corner, and people had to come to him. I'm like, hey, Steve, move out here. You've got to look like you want to be a part of this group. And so for him, it was simply the biggest thing was getting him not to look tentative, because he was typically a private person and he had to be more public. I remember the CEO of ESPN at the time, George Bodenheimer, who actually I understand lives in the Naples area. He started as working in the tape room, logging tapes and giving rides from the airport for their talent. And then he became the most powerful person in the sports industry as the head of ESPN and ABC Sports. And he was the humblest guy you could ever know. He was wonderful to work with. Just a pleasure from beginning to end. And he hired me to teach him to speak more dynamically. And I said, George, your brand, ESPN, is so charismatic and dynamic, etc. And you fight that. You're the opposite when you get up in front of an audience. It's like ho-hum. I said, you've got to make that brand what they see, hear, and feel in everything you do. And I asked him to put his right arm out shoulder high, and people listening at this podcast, if you do this, you'll get exactly what I mean. And you put your forefingers and your thumbs together in a circle, like the OK sign. And then I say, put the circle on your chin. On your chin, just like Nina just did. People follow what they see instead of what they hear. And what leaders in particular need to understand is that we are very much a visual society, more and more each day. And the vast majority, 68% of people learn by seeing, by the visual impact. So if what people are seeing, hearing, and your content doesn't mesh, doesn't align, they're going to believe first what they see. So you have an answer to something, but you look nervous, they're going to think nervous, and they're not going to trust the answer. If the sound of your voice contradicts the message, we've got everything under control. They're not going to believe it. And so it doesn't matter if you've got your content right if what they see and what they hear doesn't match the content. And so, all of that, there's so many ways that sometimes simple and sometimes much, much, much more complex. You can't make everything look and sound right and not have the foundation for what's right. If the culture is wrong, if the operation is not making people first and not doing what they're supposed to, you can't fix it all by saying something that's just right in a way that people are going to believe, because it's going to come up to catch you.
Wow. Well, speaking of the visuals, let's talk a little bit about social media. What role are you seeing social media play in adding fuel to the fire during modern crises, and then how can a business sort of leverage that to help recover?
Sure. Social media is inescapable now. I talk about traditional and social media being like scrambling eggs. Once you scramble eggs, you can't separate them. You can't separate the milk from the eggs. It's social media and traditional media are one, and they work side by side and in conjunction with each other, and one may take precedence over the other at a particular time. But the typical journalist today is on social media to amplify what they may be writing or putting on TV anyway. So oftentimes at the same time or even in advance, they're putting on social media what they're going to be putting in their traditional media outlet or legacy outlet. So you have to have an understanding at the very least of social media, because when an emergency or a crisis hits, you can, if you're fast enough, you can stop at incident level if you're identifying it and dealing with people at the right level. So by that I mean, imagine that an incident is there's a bomb threat, and the emergency, the next level up, is it's a real bomb. The crisis is the bomb goes off. So bomb threat, real bomb, bomb goes off. If there's a threat and you don't deal with it effectively, it's going to escalate. It could very easily escalate to a full-scale crisis right away. And so the idea is that with social media, rumors just take off like crazy, and they're amplified. Even the President of the United States repeats rumors on a regular basis on Twitter by retweeting, reposting somebody's comment on Twitter, not knowing who the source is, what their credibility is, etc. And so that perpetuates it even more. So the velocity, the speed with which an incident becomes a crisis, or a crisis is amplified even more, is phenomenally fueled by social media. Plus the scope. Again, something that was once would have stayed in your own backyard, in your own community, within your own company or organization, because of social media, now can get worldwide exposure immediately. And it could be a disgruntled employee. It could be a customer. I remember just last week I was buying tickets to an Elton John concert, and I had not done that online with this particular company, and I bought these tickets, and when I got my receipt, I had $1,000 worth of fees on top of the expensive price of 2 tickets. And I was appalled, and I immediately called them, and they said, well, we can't do anything. Once you buy a ticket, that's it. And I said, I want you to understand, I've called American Express, and I told them to stop, not let this charge go through. And I have 13,000 followers on Twitter, and I will not hesitate to tell everybody the poor customer service practices and policies and procedures you have. So be assured this is not going to stop here. And the next day I got a call, and they said, we'll return the $1,000 in fees to you. Will that satisfy you? And sometimes, just stating what the social media amplification could be. Imagine the PR nightmare that they're dealing with someone with 13,000 followers, most of which are media people, so could amplify it even more. I've been on airplanes, and I remember my parents were ill, and they were living on the east side of Florida, and I came from somewhere else to go to see them, and so I had a big suitcase, and when I left them, I got on the plane in West Palm Beach, and I was 6 pounds overweight. I had spent over $1,000 for my flight because it was the last minute. I was a platinum flyer. I had over 1 million miles with their airline, and they were charging me $90 for 6 pounds overweight, and they said there's nothing we can do. And again, I told them, in fact, I walked away and I said, are you kidding me? US Air at the time, are you kidding me, US Air? I paid $1,000, I did this, I did that, and they saw the number of followers I had. By the time I landed in Charlotte, North Carolina, they had returned my $90. So social media, all you need is one customer. All you need is one vendor. All you need is somebody observing what happened and misconstruing it, or seeing something that you don't see, and on social media they can amplify that and create major havoc. But you need, as organizations and as individuals, to be able to be on social media in advance, to know what best practices are, to be able to use those best practices consistently, and you need to be listening online to social media. And there are all kinds of tools, free tools, from free Hootsuite to much more deeper and more costly, $5,000 a month tools where you can listen to anything and everything that is relevant to you and your business and your issues, so that you can get the pulse of the public and social media and be able to use that real time to reconfigure your messaging, to be somewhere else. If you're communicating on Facebook, but people are talking about it on Twitter or Instagram, you need to be there where they're communicating. So listening deeply, it's a business intelligence tool that is amazing. If you use it and are willing to take the insights, take the data, the knowledge that you get from the data, to insight, and then insight to understanding and activation, and be able to take that right up to the decision makers quickly so that they can use it, not a month later when it's too late to do anything about it.
Do you think it's more important these days to sort of react to every social media comment to have a positive response to it, or are there some instances where it's better for, especially a small business, to sort of let a comment lie and just sort of see where it goes from there before you jump in?
You shouldn't be responding to everything. Clearly you're not going to function well when that happens. And again, if there is something that's really wrong, an incident or an emergency or a crisis, you're probably not going to have all the facts right away. And that's one of the keys in communicating in a crisis management mode, and that is that you will never have all the facts, and because it's so fluid, but you're going to have to say, this is what I know, this is what I don't know, and this is what I'm going to find out. Be accountable and follow through.
So back to a business in crisis, would you say it's more important to start internally with your messaging or externally?
Most organizations leave their internal audiences to last. They think it's more important to be prepared, or to deal with the media requests, or to deal with their biggest customer, or their vendors, or whatever. And they're like, I don't have time. There's never enough resources. But you've got to find a way to manage the crisis, to manage the communications, and to manage business resumption processes from the very start. And they have to be done simultaneously, no matter what your crisis is, or no matter what your resources available are. And so what I hear most often is, I don't have time to, I can get to the employees, that, they love us, we'll get to them later. But the reality is, they can be your best ambassadors of goodwill if they feel like they're in the loop and they're being dealt with and communicated with authentically from the people at the top. Nobody likes to be blindsided. And if they go home and their neighbors, or people they like or even don't like in their neighborhood, look at them askance, or say, well, what really happened here? And they don't have an answer. They even if they wanted to give an answer, if they don't have an answer, then they're going to wonder why. Why aren't you sharing with us what really happened, or what the solutions in progress are? Because they're the face of the organization in their home, in their neighborhood. I mean, most of the time they can't even tell their spouses or their significant others or their kids. They can't answer those questions. And if it pops up on the news, or it's in the newspaper, or it's on radio, and they said, hey mom, what about? Or hey dad, what's this? Or can you, and you don't have an answer that's believable, then they're not going to trust the people who are their leaders within the organization.
What are some ways that a business owner can prepare their staff in advance of a crisis? What kinds of plans can they have in place?
First of all, you need to have a written plan. A written plan. You can't have it in your head, because say it's in your head, Nina, and you're in the hospital at the particular time when it needs to be activated. And if it's only in your head, then
it doesn't exist.
Doesn't exist, So the reality is, you have to have a written plan and figure out who your key constituencies are, who are your stakeholders, and then who's going to be the best one to communicate how with them. But the written plan, part of it will be the communication, part will be the management. So who takes charge? Who is responsible? If it's not clear who's responsible, then you're wasting a lot of time, and it's becoming worse. So that written plan can help you with the management, the communication, and the business resumption. But you also need to do risk management. And that risk management, generally you'll have an interdisciplinary team of people, mostly inside people, but sometimes outside. It could be an outside attorney as part of your risk management team. It could be an outside PR firm or marketing firm. But sit down at least quarterly, or when there's a big change in the environment, either internally or the landscape in which you operate, and say, all right, what keeps us up at night? You in HR, what's your worst fear? You in finance, what's your worst fear? You in manufacturing, or you in the retail operation or online sales, what's your worst nightmare? And then you actually score those potential crises. And you score them based on the probability of it occurring and the impact if it does occur. So if it occurs, give it a 1 to 10. Is the chance of X worry occurring 80%? And would the impact of it occurring be detrimental, be a 10? Then if it's a 10 and it's 80% probability, it's in a high quadrant. So think of 4 quadrants. High impact, high probability. Low impact, high probability. Then you look at low probability, low impact, low probability but high impact, and you say, all right, where do I put my resources? I want to put my resources in right now to those issues that will be high impact and high probability. And it's funny, but unless you go through that exercise, it typically doesn't happen. It's the way you've always done business. All right, we're gonna look at this, or you may wait till once a year to really scour the landscape for what the problems may be, and then it's too late. So the key is with risk management, identifying those potential risks up front, and what the probability and the impact of those risks would be, and then where you need to put your resources when, and assigning someone to be responsible for it. And if it's say it may be medium impact, but it's low probability, maybe you just assign someone to keep an eye on it. And 3 months later, when you get back together again, that person brings up no change, or there's been a significant change, we need to readdress this, etc. And so risk management committee that's interdisciplinary and meeting at least quarterly, or when something significant has changed. There could be an illness of a senior executive that could be problematic. That might trigger a meeting. And then have a written crisis plan identifying incident, emergency, and crisis, and good examples for them that anybody could follow, and procedures. In an incident, this is what we do and who's responsible for it. In an emergency, this is what we do and who's responsible for it. In a crisis, these people are in charge, these are our priorities, and this is how we go about it. And then test your plan. Because anything on paper, as well put together as it is, you're going to find when you test it, something's not going to work the way you think it does. And unless you physically test that plan, it probably is not going to be as effective as you think.
Can you share an example of testing your crisis plan?
Yeah, I worked with a major manufacturing company for 25 years, Milliken & Company. They were my client, and they were a phenomenal company and still are. And so I wrote a crisis plan. I kept telling them they needed a crisis plan. They needed a crisis plan. They're like, yeah, the head of PR. And one day I get a call. I'm in the cafeteria because I was there doing a workshop. And they said, well, please come see me because we've had a death in a plant. Somebody went out to the car, got a gun, and shot someone in the plant. And we need to know what to do. And so after that, we dealt with the emergency right then and there. And then we backed off and we wrote a crisis plan, identifying the what ifs and the responsibilities and so on. After we wrote that plan, and it was with a great deal of attention, and it wasn't something done overnight, and with I led a team of interdisciplinary people to do this. Then we created workshops for their plant managers all over the world. In the event of a crisis, this is the company's crisis plan, and this is what how you need to deal with it. And then they took it to, as I said, they were an outstanding company. Then they took the workshops that we did that were mandatory for people of a certain management level within the company, and we actually created full-scale crisis drills at some of their facilities and tested them out with local emergency responders and politicians and everything else. So they went to the nth degree. First a plan, then first risk management, then a plan, then workshops that teach key people in the organization that there was a plan and how to use it, etc., and who to call, etc., and then they actually tested the plan with full-scale emergency drills that were like, a fire drill, at a school, or unfortunately now, a active shooter drill. They tested to see, all right, We think this is what's going to happen and where things are going to go. One point, when we did the first test, we found out that within this very large manufacturing plant, if people were in certain conference rooms, you couldn't hear the loudspeaker announcing that there was an emergency and that people needed to leave. You couldn't hear the fire alarm, you couldn't hear anything, because it was soundproofed so that they could have their meetings and not be disturbed. Well, we never would have known that if we hadn't done the drill, and then obviously it was dealt with.
Wow. So what is an example of somebody addressing a crisis publicly badly? Like, what are some
Oh, we see those bad examples
Right.
all the time.
What are some key things that you think people should try to avoid as they're addressing it?
Well, first of all, you need to know who's going to be your spokesperson, and that they're well trained and that they're prepped for that particular issue or situation. So just because they're the CEO or the head of HR doesn't mean that they are good communicators, or are good communicators on social media or on television. They may be great if somebody sits down and they're writing something in advance, and they can, in the paper they look fine, but on TV they look like a deer in the headlights, So you have to know who your spokespeople are. They need to be well educated and trained on responding quickly and effectively. And you need to know who your team is going to be to candidly test out the messaging in advance on different platforms, so that it's not left to one person, because what you think the issue is and what you think the best solutions are and what people are most concerned about are not necessarily what somebody else thinks out in the public. And basically, if you think, well, it's common sense, the reality is what you think is common sense and what someone else thinks is common sense is totally different.
So are there any other words of wisdom you haven't shared that you think business owners should be aware of?
Well, I thoroughly appreciate being able to be on the podcast and to be able to present to the Chamber group this morning. And I opened my presentation with a quote from Helen Keller. Worse than being blind is to be able to see and have no vision. How many times do you see indicators out there and you say, well, I'll get to it, or it's not as bad, and you ignore it, and then all of a sudden it's in front of you. Anticipate. Things move too fast these days, and in too many different directions, and too far, much further than they ever did in the past. And you can't afford, if you're with an organization, or you're a family and your job is to protect your family in case of a hurricane here or whatever, you need to be prepared up front, so that the intricacies of that particular situation, that you can give your attention to those unique elements, because everything you could figure out in advance and decide has already been decided.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Kathleen. If you'd like to learn more about Kathleen's work, visit sportsmediachallenge.com or follow her on Twitter at sportsmediachal.
Or at Kathleen Hessert, spelled Kathleen Hessert it's like dessert with an H. Hessert. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Chamber Chat. Don't forget to tune in next Tuesday for a brand new episode. You can find us on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and all major podcast platforms. Don't forget to subscribe.